Hi everyone. I just want to welcome you to our Psychology Public Lecture Series. It's really wonderful to see so many of you here this evening, but I really think this is a testament to our speaker, Professor Matthew Hornsey, whom I have the very great pleasure of introducing to you this evening. Matthew is Professor of Social Psychology at the University of Queensland, and he'll be known to many of you here. He's been working at UQ for the last 13 years. During this time, he's been recipient of the prestigious Australian Psychological Society's Early Career Award. He's given endless hours of service and support as Associate Dean for research in the faculty, and academics will recognise him for his work on many editorial boards, and he currently serves as Associate Editor for the international journal Group Processes and Intergroup Relations. Matthew has published extensively over the years on topics such as social conformity, multiculturalism, and bystander apathy. But today, he's going to break a bit of ground here, a new ground in sharing his work and views on imposters. A fascinating topic, which I'm sure you'll agree, and probably like me, you're keen to find out what it actually is that makes us pretend to be something that we're not. Matthew suggests that the battle for authenticity is a modern obsession. But he also poses us with a question. Is it a battle that we're doomed to lose? This evening we're going to find out. So please join me in welcoming Matthew Hornsey.
Thanks for that intro, Kath, and thanks to all of you for coming along, all the alums and the future alums who have given up your evening to come and hear me talk. Kath said that I'll be sharing some of my ideas and research, probably more ideas than research. I'm not going to get bogged down in any particular research paradigm. I'm going to be kind of surfing in a fairly free-form way around various themes of impostorism and authenticity and personas, etc. But I do have a little program of research on imposters, and to the extent that I'll be talking a bit about that, I just wanted to acknowledge the contribution of Yolanda Yatton, who is my collaborator on that program of research. But I'm going to start off by talking about this guy. His name's David. David was driving along the highway between California and Mexico about 5 years ago when he had a terrible car accident. And he was pretty messed up by it, right? So he was left with an amputated arm, and he had some pretty bad head injuries. And the head injuries were severe enough that he was put into a coma. He stayed in a coma for about 5 weeks. But when he woke up, his family and friends were somewhat reassured because he seemed to have gotten away with it neurologically. Okay, so he seemed relatively normal. He seemed the same smart, articulate, emotionally balanced David that they knew. But then strange things started happening, right? So he would talk to his doctor and he would complain. He'd say, you know, I'm living in this house and there's this woman who's living in the house and she looks exactly like my mom, but it's not my mom. It's an imposter. It's a replica, right? And he had the same thing about his dad, right? There's this guy, he's hanging around, and he looks 100% like my dad, but he's not the real deal. And the imposter parents were never as good as the real parents, right? So the mum would make him his favorite meal, and he'd go, you know, that was pretty good, but it's not as good as how my real mum makes it. It's just not as tasty, right? Or he'd say, you know, you look so much like my dad, you look like 100% like my dad, but you're not as good a driver as my dad is. My dad would never drive as fast as this, right? So what David was suffering from is a very rare disorder called the Capgras delusion, where you're haunted by the sense that your loved ones have been replaced by an identical-looking replica. And sufferers of this delusion live in this weird village of the damned kind of world, right? Where everyone looks kind of familiar, but there's something kind of sinister and cold about it. It's not the real deal. And when this delusion was first discovered about 90 years ago, the original explanation for it was very Freudian, right? And so the story went like this, okay? You're born as a child, you have these kind of emerging erotic fantasies about your mother, right? So this is the Oedipal complex, okay? And naturally these feelings are kind of disturbing and weird to you. right? So you try and push them down, you repress them, you push them deep down into your unconscious. And that works fine. But the argument is that when you have a head injury, that your ability to be able to suppress these thoughts is impaired, right? So suddenly all these erotic feelings surge to the surface, and you've got to make sense of that, right? You've got the horn for your mum, and you've got to try and reconcile that to yourself. And then one way you can do that is to go, okay, well, you know, it's not really my mum. It's just someone who looks 100% like my mum. It's like it's a replica. And it's a fabulous theory, right? It's very creative. But unfortunately, it's easily falsifiable because people have this not just about their mum, but their dad. Some people have had it about their pet dog, their little kind of poodle. It's not really their poodle anymore. It's like a robot or a replica. You can have it about your house. You can even have it about yourself, right? You look in the mirror. That person looking back at me looks like me, but it's not me. You feel like an imposter to yourself. So the standard explanation for the delusion now is more neurological. Okay, so there's David there. If you receive messages through the retina, it gets sent to the fusiform gyrus, and the job of the fusiform gyrus is to process faces. It's very good at that, right? But it doesn't stop there. Once it's processed the face, it then relays the message onto the amygdala, which is part of the limbic system, the emotional core of the brain. And its job is to register the emotional significance of what you're looking at, right? So if you see your mum, okay, it's not just the image that you see, there's a whole lot of emotional resonances of that. You feel warmth or attraction. Did I say attraction? That's so Freudian. Oh my God. You feel warmth, love, guilt, terror, you know, whatever it is, right? Now the argument is that people have got Capgras delusion. The wiring that connects the fusiform gyrus and the amygdala is severed. Okay, so you can process the face fine, but you're just not getting all the normal emotional signals that you'd expect to feel. It feels cold and weird. And one way of making sense of that is that it's not really your mum. Okay, it's an imposter. And the theory makes sense. Okay, so David didn't have this weird feeling if he spoke to his parents over the phone. Right? It was only when he was seeing them face to face, because auditory processing happens in a different spot of the brain. Okay, and so the connection between that and the amygdala is not necessarily jeopardized by the accident. So it all makes sense. Of course, we don't actually live in a world where there are identical looking replicas of our loved ones floating around, and maybe there will be one day, but there's not at the moment. But what we do have are people who sometimes fake their backstories to pretend to be a loved one. Okay, so the classic example of this, some of you would be aware of the story of Martin Guerre. Martin Guerre was a 16th century French peasant, and by all accounts, he was a bit of a cretin, and eventually he just walked out on his wife and kids, and that was a really dramatic thing to do in 16th century France. According to the laws there, if your husband walked out, you couldn't remarry. And so this woman was left trying to raise the family on her own with all the poverty that that implies, right? Then suddenly, 8 years later, a miracle occurs. Martin Guerre just rocks back up. And he folds back into the family, and they play happy families for 3 years. But during this time, some people start to get suspicious. Not everyone, but some people start to get suspicious it wasn't the real Martin Guerre. For a start, the old Martin Guerre was a bit of a creep, and this guy was kind of nice, right? And these suspicions grew to the point where they actually held a trial. He was in fact an imposter. At the trial, his wife swore black and blue that he was the real deal. His 4 sisters, okay, each were adamant that this was the real Martin Guerre. And it looked very much like he was going to get off, when suddenly and very dramatically, the real Martin Guerre literally just rocked up at the courthouse during the trial and blew the case open, right? And so it turned out that he was not Martin Guerre, he was an imposter, Arnaud de Thiel, and he was actually put to death for that, right? A more recent case is a sad story of Nicholas Barclay. He's a 13-year-old Texan boy. Just a few years ago, he went off to play basketball with his friends, and he never came back. Okay, he disappeared without a trace. But then, again, 3 years later, a miracle, right? Nicholas Barclay returns. And he's folded back into the family and embraced as the long-lost son, right? But after a few months, one of the local PIs had read about the story in the paper, got suspicious, started investigating, and it turned out that this new Nicholas Barclay who had rocked up was in fact Frederic Baudin, right? He was a French conman who was notorious for impostoring other people, including missing children, right? Nice guy, right? Now, what was extraordinary about both these stories is the extent to which the impostorism was allowed to survive for so long, right? How they got away with these stories for so long. So, yeah, Martin Guerre, or Arnaud de Thiel, looked an awful lot like Martin Guerre, right? But you'd have to think that, surely the wife, maybe, who was sleeping with this guy, might have had some inkling, or the four sisters, but in fact, it was the people who were closest to him who were the slowest, actually, to cotton on to the fact that there was a problem. And the lie that Frederic Baudin was telling was outrageous. Okay, Frederic Baudin looked nothing like Nicholas Barclay. I mean, there were 3 years between, but still. Frederic had brown eyes. Okay, Nicholas had blue eyes. Frederic had an unshakable French accent, right? Quite different from the Texan Nicholas. And Frederic was a whole 7 years older than Nicholas, right? And so, and yet it was 5 months before that lie got exposed. Okay? And not by the mum, not by the dad, not by the family, it was by a stranger. Okay? So, such is the power of wishful thinking. Right? Not all imposters fake being another person. It's much more common for people to fake their backstories, to fake the kind of person they are. And history is full of these people. Women who have tried to pass as men. We know a bunch of people who have tried to pass off as royalty, including our friend the Tahitian prince in the bottom right-hand corner who ripped off all the money, right? And people who have faked being members of a minority ethnic group. And again, it's amazing how many people get away with this and how long they get away with it, despite what seems like smoking gun evidence that there's something not right, okay? So, this lady at the top right-hand corner, her name's Helen Demidенko. This is someone that I went to uni with here at the University of Queensland, and she became famous for writing this book, The Hand That Signed the Paper, which I think at the time was the first debut novel ever to win the Miles Franklin Award. It was a big deal back in '95. And the book was based on the stories that her Ukrainian uncle told her about his experiences during World War II. And Helen liked to make a big deal about her Ukrainian heritage. She would dress in Ukrainian costumes and recite Ukrainian poems and sing Ukrainian songs, etc. But it turned out it was all crap. Helen Demdenko was in fact Helen Darville. She had completely manufactured this Ukrainian heritage. And what I find fascinating about that story is that she was 21 before she started faking her Ukrainian heritage. And she wasn't an isolate or a misfit. There must have been literally hundreds and hundreds of people who suspected her secret, or who personally knew her very English parents, right? And yet it was 2 years before the whistle got blown. Other examples are even stranger. This is circling there is Billy Tipton. Billy Tipton was a very talented and fairly successful jazz musician, and it wasn't until after he died that people discovered that he was in fact a she. And this is despite the fact, mind you, that she had 4 wives, right, in her lifetime, or 4 long-term girlfriends at least. Okay, all of whom claimed that they didn't know they were in fact married to a woman. Right? And I know. Now, in their defense, Billy went to extraordinary lengths to disguise her secret. She said that she'd had a terrible car accident when she was younger. Well, that would explain the need to have the bandages around her chest all the time. That would explain the need for the prosthetic penis. But all the same, you have to think, that there'd be some inkling of what was going on. You'd think the same thing of Shi Pei Pu. Here, some of you may know the story of Zen Butterfly. Shi Pei Pu was a Chinese male opera singer who passed as a woman so convincingly that he formed a sexual relationship with a male French ambassador, and from that point of intimacy was able to extract sensitive information which he then passed on to the Chinese government. So Shi Pei Pu was what was it? It was a man pretending to be a woman and also a spy, so like a double imposter. And again, they'd have sex rarely and quickly, and should be often fully clothed and in the dark, but all the same, you have to be wondering what's going on in this French guy's mind. I call this imposter blindness. One of my favourite stories of imposter blindness relates to this person, Hannah Snell. She was a sailor. She was actually a member of the British Navy for many years. And during this time, she imposted as her brother-in-law, actually, James Gray. And there was this one great anecdote where, while she was on a naval ship, she'd been busted for getting drunk and rabble-rousing, and she'd been sentenced to the lash. And of course, the lash is delivered to a bareback. And the captain of the ship, in his log, noted these strange breast-like shapes on this man's chest, and yet still the penny didn't drop, right? Okay, so presumably it just lay so far outside the realm of people's imagination that a woman could be a soldier, right? That he just couldn't trust what he was seeing with his own eyes. So I think in some ways this kind of imposter blindness speaks to a charming aspect of modern society, that we have this reputation as being cynical and hard-bidding and skeptical, but in fact people are incredibly trusting, really, that other people are who they say they are. Okay? You never think to question that the masked man standing over your naked body with a knife is in fact a surgeon. Okay? You probably never thought to question whether I ever got a PhD or whether I'm really from the University of Queensland, right? You just trust these things implicitly. I think to lie about what you've done is one thing, but to lie about who you are is a lie that seems to be so taboo and so breathtaking that people are kind of relatively slow to suspect it. And even if you do suspect it, you'd want to be 100% sure before you blow the whistle, right? Okay? If you accuse somebody of being an imposter and you're wrong, you're trying to pull off the fake beard and it's not coming off kind of thing, well, you can guarantee that's going to be the most embarrassing day of your life, right? So one message here is it's not hard to get away with dramatic impostorism, not as hard as you think. And so it shouldn't surprise you to know that impostorism is rife. One tiny little subculture of impostorism involves people faking war veteran status. So all these people are war veteran imposters. Some of them fake service in Vietnam, some in Iraq, some in Afghanistan. This lady shaking the hand of the mayor, faked being a survivor of September 11. This is Rex Crane. He manufactured a whole story of being a prisoner of war during World War II. He ended up being the president of a POW advocacy group, but it was all made up. And there are so many of these people out there that there's an organization that's been developed whose sole purpose it is to expose these types of examples of military impostorism. And get this, in the last 4 years, and this is in Australia and New Zealand alone, in the last 4 years, there's been 242 cases of verified deception. And some of it's quite mild, people just exaggerating service, but some of it's more dramatic, like wearing fake medals or just making up service that never existed. Of course, one domain of life in which the capacity for impostorism is virtually infinite is online, right? So I couldn't resist telling this story. This is Nev Shulman. Nev is a young photographer in New York, and he'd been contacted by an 8-year-old girl, Abby. And Abby was a precociously good artist, and I think she wanted some kind of artist mentor in New York, so she just contacted this guy on Facebook, and they started chatting on Facebook, and they started chatting over the phone as well. And Nev contacted the mum, of course, Angela, and just to make sure it's legit and that she was cool with this, and she was. And in fact, she started sending some of Abby's artwork to him as gifts, and so they developed this friendship. Right? And while Nev and Abby were making friends, he got to know also Abby's gorgeous 19-year-old sister, Megan, right? And they started developing a long-distance relationship. And you know, they were just texting endlessly and emailing endlessly and having phone sex and all that, right? Megan also was a talented artist. She had a great voice, and she'd sent him MP3s of her recordings of various songs. But this is where everything started to unravel, because he started to find out that some of these songs that she was sending him were just ripped off YouTube, right? And they weren't her at all. So of course he started getting suspicious, and him and his mates drive down to Michigan to confront her. And when they get there, they find out that Abby is in fact real, but she's not an artist. She's never put a brush to the canvas in her life. And, tragically, the gorgeous Megan does not exist. Okay, neither do any of the hundreds of friends and acquaintances on her Facebook page, right? All of these were fabrications of the devilish Angela, right? It was Angela who had been corresponding with Nev. They were Angela's paintings that she'd been sending to Nev, and it was Angela that had been having phone sex with all this time, right? So that's a fairly dramatic example of impostorism, but you know, the thing about online impostorism is it doesn't have to be dramatic, and it frequently isn't, right? Part of the online universe is that you can reinvent yourself and manufacture identities and personalities, and that's part of the fun. You can literally be an avatar or a shapeshifter, and it doesn't have to be sinister or weird, right? So notice we're getting increasingly subtle here. We started talking about dramatic examples of impostorism, the freaks and weirdos and con men, etc. And now we're getting into a domain where any one of us could plausibly imagine ourselves engaging in light impostorism, right, online. Okay, so I'm just going to get more subtle again. Like, what about a situation where I smile even if I'm not feeling happy, right? Or what if I'm feeling nervous, but I pretend to be in control and calm? I pretend to be interested in somebody's conversation, but I'm actually distracted by something else. Okay? There's actually quite a fine line, I would argue, between what we traditionally call impostorism and what we might traditionally consider to be social skill or politeness, okay, or impression management. So I'm going to take a bit of a detour now and just talk a little bit about that, right? And the most famous social scientist to talk about this was this guy, Erving Goffman. Goffman used dramaturgical analogy to describe life. Life is a stage, life is theatre, we have roles and scripts, we have audiences, etc. And according to Goffman, most of our public life is a performance, right? Occasionally, we have rare moments where we find trusted people and we can kind of go backstage, in inverted commas, and we can be ourselves, in inverted commas. But mostly that's not the case. Most of us spend most of our time performing, and some of us spend all of our time performing, right? And in this world, there's no such thing as authenticity, okay? To Goffman, there's just convincing and unconvincing ways of acting authentic. Okay, but is that really the case? Is that just cynical, or are we just performing our heads off, right? So let's assume there's a spectrum, okay? If you're on the left, you're the 100% chameleon, right? You're 100% responsive to your social environment. Or you lay on the right, okay? So you're a rugged individual, and you have this authentic self, which you carry around all the time in every situation to every person. Okay, so you may lie somewhere in that spectrum. Okay? But what I'm going to argue is that most of us lie much further over in this chameleon end of the spectrum than we realize or that we're prepared to admit. Okay? Now I'm going to make this case in two really broad ways. Right? The first case I want to make is that people are superficial, and I suspect you probably already know that, right? So I'm not going to labour this point, but probably the fastest way to make that point is to do this, right? Okay. Now it probably took you about 1/10 of 1 second to process that they're good looking, right? Usually we don't have to work that hard at that. Okay, it's not like we're crunching through the gears, weighing it up, are they good looking? You kind of just know, right? And that's because evolution has taught us that there's certain superficial markers that are signs of genetic health. And we process that fairly organically and automatically as physical beauty. Okay, and it turns out that the power of physical beauty is quite enormous. Okay? So every mum says their baby's beautiful, right? And they really do think that. But as it turns out, you know, some babies are more objectively beautiful than others, right? and it turns out that if you happen to have an objectively beautiful baby, you gaze at them more, and you play with them more, and you're more affectionate with them than if you've got a slightly more messed up baby, right? That's pretty superficial, right? Mums in their own flesh and blood. But it gets worse. The babies are just as bad. Right? They're only hours old. And babies are a sucker for a pretty face. They're going to stare at a pretty face, an attractive face, more than an unattractive face. So even babies are superficial, right? We know that kids are superficial. We've all been to school, Okay, I don't need to tell you this, that the good-looking kids tend to be popular, etc. Okay, so we know that. But probably less understood is the fact that teachers are also creepily superficial. Okay, so they smile more at good-looking kids than less good-looking kids. They think the good-looking kids are smarter than the less good-looking kids, and they think they have more academic potential. And that's if you control for their objective academic pedigree, right? Of course, we know that when people are dating, people are superficial. We kind of, you know, we're attracted to beautiful people, and it's true that good-looking people tend to get more dates and they're more likely to get married. Okay, but probably what's more surprising is the judges also are superficial, right? They give lighter criminal sentences to good-looking people than to less good-looking people for exactly the same crime. And if you need any more convincing, take a look at this. This is the strange case of men and height. Taller men are seen to be smarter. Taller men are seen to have more leadership potential. The average height of a man in America is 5'9". Okay? But of CEOs in America, 30% of them are 6'2" or taller. Okay? That's really tall. So CEOs are like the Maasai tribe of America. So are American presidents. America hasn't elected a president below average height since 1900. It's 113 years of electing presidents above average height. Okay? And taller people earn significantly more money. Okay? In fact, some studies, not all, but some studies suggest that height in men is a better predictor of success and income than intelligence. Right? So yes, we are superficial. Right? So no wonder there's all this. This, of course, is us literally being chameleons, changing our skin to suit our audiences, to gain social advantage. But we also do this kind of stuff even to ourselves, even where we're the only audience we have. Okay, so this is me. Okay, this is a photo of me. And this image on the right, we have the faces of about a dozen male models morphed together to create this kind of psycho, super handsome, freaky sex god guy, right? And, okay, so this is me and morphed to be 20% like the super freaky handsome guy, right? Okay, so it's me plus 20% more attractive. And so I want to thank Sean Murphy, who does research on this paradigm, for helping, well, actually doing this morphing for me. Now, the weird thing about this is that this guy on the right, that is actually how I think I look all the time, right? I don't know who this weird guy is on the left. It's just weird, misshapen, strange-looking dude. That feels right to me. And it turns out that's what most people think. If you give people a whole bunch of images of themselves, and one of them is the real photo, and the other images are various images where you morph to look more or less like various attractive or unattractive targets, and you say to people, pick the one that's really you, okay? Then they tend to pick the one that's them plus about 20% more attractive, okay? And the reasons for this are complex, but one simple reason is that we fake how we look to ourselves. You know, you look at yourself in mirrors that flatter you, you look at yourself with flattering lighting, at flattering angles. We tend to have like mirror faces, you know, weird facial expressions that we pull when we look in the mirror. My kids are always paying me out for my mirror face. And we convince ourselves that we're just that little bit more good looking than we really are. So I've spoken about us changing our appearance to suit our audience. Now let's talk about changing our behavior to suit our audience. Okay, let's go back to the newborn infants. Okay? As it turns out, babies that are just hours old are kind of like chameleons, right? So if you stand over the cot and pull a face, you poke your tongue out, for example, the baby will try and poke their tongue out as well. Or you open your mouth, the baby will try and open their mouth. They don't do it very well. They're still pretty hopeless at that age. They're a bit unco, but they make an effort, right? Okay, so this chameleon thing is partly kind of hardwired into our brains. They do it within hours. And sometimes that capacity for imitation reaches ludicrous levels. And I'll show you this experiment. And this is a paradigm that Mark Nilsson at this university uses. So in this experiment, kids are shown that there's a toy in a box. and then the experimenter just shuts the box, and the kid's job is to try and open the box to get the toy. Okay? But before they do that, the experimenter demonstrates to the kids how to open the box. Now, in fact, to open the box is really easy. You just grab the knob and open the lid, right? And you grab the toy. But rather than doing that, the experimenter demonstrates opening the box in this really circuitous way. So they pick up the random stick, and they might wave it around the top of the box, maybe tap the box a couple of times, and then reach around the back and jab the door open from behind, and they just go through this weird, superstitious palaver, right? Okay, so the question is, when it's the kid's turn to open the box to grab the toy, what do they do? And the data look more or less like this. So at 12 months, the kids do watch the experimenter do the bizarre demonstration, but then they kind of go, okay, right, and they just reach out with their chubby little hands and grab the knob and just grab the toy. So they take the shortest, most common sense route to getting the toy. But look what happens once they get a bit older. Okay, by 18 months, half of them are just like opening the box and grabbing the toy, but half of them are imitating the bizarre demonstration of the experimenter. Right? And at 2 years, they virtually are all imitating the bizarre demonstration of the experimenter. I find this data really profound because it suggests that this kind of imitation or following others is a kind of social skill. For these kids at least, they do it more, the more sophisticated they are, the smarter they are. Right? Okay, let's fast forward to adulthood. Let's stop talking about kids. Let's talk about adult humans. And so this classic Solomon Asch study, you show people 3 lines, and your job is to say which of the lines on the right matches the length of the line on the left. And the task is meant to be easy, right? It should be fairly obvious that the answer is B. Okay? The twist in this experiment is that of all the people in that room who are doing the experiment, only one of them is a true participant, okay, who thinks this really is a study on line lengths. Okay? All the other people are confederates. They're actors paid by the experimenter to effectively screw with the head of the true participant, right? And so imagine you're that true participant. You've got the task. You've locked in B. This is easy. Okay? And then all the other people call out their answers, and one by one, with no hesitation, with no apparent anxiety, they call out A, right? You're watching this drama unfold, and now it's your turn to give your answer. What do you say? Well, it turns out that about 1/3 of the time, people fake what they know to be true, okay? They change what they know to be true or common sense to go along with the group, and they say A as well, right? So their adult minds are behaving a bit like the kids' minds. They're adjusting what they know to be true to fit in. And you might say, well, of course, in that context, you might do that. This chameleon thing works in a situation like this because the stakes are really low. You've got no real principle to stand up for. Who cares what you say in this task? Okay, so let's raise the stakes dramatically. Okay, let's have a look at this study, famous study, where there's a bunch of people in a room filling out a questionnaire, and halfway through the session, as you're filling out this random questionnaire, some sinister-looking smoke starts piling in from under the door. Now, the question in this experiment is how many people get up to investigate? Okay, how many people get up to check to see what's going on with the smoke? Okay, so it depends. On the left here, this is what happens if people are just on their own in the room. Okay, and 4 out of 5 people just eventually pop up from their chair and go to the door and open it and try and work out what's going on. This is exactly what you should do, right? Okay, because the smoke could mean a fire, and it could mean that your life's in danger. So they're doing the common sense thing. Okay, but in other conditions, what they did is they had you filling out the survey with 2 other people, right? And not just 2 other people, but 2 confederates again. And their job is to just keep doing the questionnaire, not to talk, not to look around, and to act like nothing's happening. Okay? And look at the data. Like, only 1 in 10 people got up to check to see if the smoke was a problem. Okay, you can see them. It's not like they're not stressed. They're looking around, they look anxious. But eventually you can kind of almost see them going, okay, well, I guess it's all right. And they kind of go back to their questionnaire, right? So it's remarkable data in a way because it says that you're taking the cues from total strangers that there's nothing wrong to assume that there really is nothing wrong. Not just that, you're prepared to stake your life on that. Okay, that's an extraordinary gesture of faith. So the point being made is that people live for other people see reality through other people, and people perform for other people. That's probably a good thing. The humans look after us, right? So it's good to pay attention to them, right? But there's downsides. All this performing, it can get kind of exhausting, right? Sometimes it's downright irrational, okay? But often it's just exhausting and complex. These are not free-willing performances that we're asked to do in life. They're not impromptu performances. They're not even necessarily fun performances, right? There are rules. There are norms of behavior. So on this slide, what I've done is I've just tried to pluck out of my head all the various rules I could think of, the norms associated with having dinner, just a social dinner. Okay, and some of these rules are really straightforward, and you don't even think about them. Yes, you probably should use plates. Yes, sit at a table. Yes, make conversation if you can, right? And some of them are little bits of etiquette and table manners that have built up over the decades. And then after I'd finished, I thought, well, there's a few, but it's not overwhelming, right? But then I realized that I'd completely forgotten about things like alcohol, wine, right? All the rules around serving and drinking alcohol. So I added those. It's amazing how many of them there are, right? Okay, and then I'd just completely forgotten about, well, sometimes you have formal dinners and there's rules around being a good host. And there's rules around being a good guest. And before you know it, the slide looks like this, right? Okay, so this is a whole lot of crap that we have to shove into our heads. And this is just social dinners. This isn't breakfast or picnics or restaurants, right? Just social dinners. And then if you have to factor in all the rules associated with going to the doctor, or rules attached to dating, rules attached to sex, rules attached to Christmas, rules attached to being a student, I don't know, Facebook, email, all that stuff, before you've even really scratched the surface of social life, you've got this enormous neural network of rules and laws and norms that you're supposed to master. And actually, humans are incredibly good at this. Like, even the most socially ridiculous person you know has internalized and mastered hundreds and hundreds of social rules. Okay, so we're very, very good at it. Okay, so every time you follow a norm, every time you follow a rule, it's like a mini performance, right? And so if life is so much around surfaces and roles and performing, where does this leave the notion of authenticity? Well, again, according to Goffman, it's when you get so good at playing your role that you start to convince yourself of your own role, and you convince other people as well of your role. And the sociologist Robert Park went even further, and he said, look, it's through the performances, it's through the roles that we actually know ourselves, and that we know other people. Okay, and not just that, he argued that the masks are your truest self, because that's the self that you really want to be, right? And if you keep playing these roles over and over again, and it becomes habitual to you, it becomes second nature, and then that becomes your true self. Right, so according to this perspective, the goal is not to find your real self, okay? The goal is to master your performances, to get your lines right, okay? To play your roles convincingly, to manage different parts of yourself to different audiences. And, really crucially, and Goffman was big on this, to make sure you keep your audiences separate, right? That's really important. If you've ever felt stressed because your parents and your friends are in the same room, or you bump into a work colleague at a nightclub, you're feeling that kind of frisson, that tension of having to manage different aspects of yourself to different audiences, but at the same time, right? This, of course, is not a new notion. This is a really ancient notion. In fact, I was blown away, many of you probably already knew this, but I was blown away to find out the etymology of the word person, right? It originally came from the Etruscan word, persu, which literally meant mask. And then that kind of got rolled into the Latin term persona, which originally meant a character in a drama. And then it morphed into the word person that we know and love. So right from the beginning, these notions of personhood and performance and mask are really intimately intertwined. And I know I'm going in pretty hard with that chameleon argument, and at this point you might be going, okay, your brain's rebelling, right? And you're thinking, come on, like all the messages in Western culture point in exactly the opposite direction to what I'm saying, and they do, right? So these are the kind of messages that I got taught as a kid, right? these are all the messages that I received as a kid. They're all the messages I still receive from the culture I'm in. And these are the messages that I'm trying to pass on to my kids. And they're all about authenticity and being true to yourself and being an individual and being genuine, right? Okay, we get hammered with this stuff. And this is a theme that's picked up by many of the most famous minds in clinical psychology over the last few generations. The kind of humanist therapists. For them, being authentic is almost synonymous with mental health, right, and self-actualization. And to compromise what you want or who you are, to fit in with other people, that's kind of, yeah, that's sad. It's a self-betrayal, okay? It's a weakness. But I would argue that the reason we have to hammer these messages all the time is precisely because we find it so hard, precisely because the odds are stacked against us, precisely because it's a battle that we're starting to lose, right? I'd also argue that, you know, if you think about it, even if you think of yourself as a really kind of rugged individual, you know, that in itself can be a kind of persona, it can be a kind of performance. Yolanda Yetman and I have done a number of papers making this case that people in Western individualist cultures conform to the norm to be nonconformist, right? That nonconformity, individualism is fundamentally about a message you're trying to send to yourself and send to the world about the kind of person you are. It's another role, potentially. And I'd argue that actually, be yourself is not the grand message of Western life, right? You often hear this, you know, people are nervous about a job interview, or they're nervous about a date, and people say, oh, just be yourself and you'll be fine, right? Okay, but I don't think they're actually really literally saying just be yourself. You know, they're not saying be nervous or be selfish or be needy. Like, you know, they're saying be your best self, right? Be dazzling, be calm, be likable, right? And I think this is the grand message of Western life, that the self is reducible to your personality, okay? And that your personality is a project, and it's a project that can continually be improved and refined and worked on, right? And that's a message, I think it's always been around, but it really kind of kicked into gear a lot with the publication of this book, How to Win Friends and Influence People, in the 30s. It hasn't been out of print in the last 70 years. It's sold over 15 million copies. Dale Carnegie, the author, was big on the little things, the little nonverbals, the little energies that you radiate are so important in how people respond to you and how people treat you, right? And he was very big on the notion of being positive, being upbeat, okay? And what if you don't feel like being positive? What if you're not feeling positive? Well, it's simple, you just fake it, right? So he writes in the book, you know, just force yourself to smile. Or if you're on your own, force yourself to whistle or hum or sing, right? You're not even safe on your own. You've got to keep this persona up, right? And this message has really become like a semi-religion in the corporate world. You know, that good executives, good leaders, good salespeople are upbeat. They don't complain, they don't whinge, they don't allow negative thoughts to cloud their minds. Okay, they're upbeat and positive. And what if you don't feel like it? That's fine, just fake it. Fake it till you make it. Fake it over and over and over again until it becomes routine, until it becomes part of your higher self or your truer self, right? And this has become such a mantra in corporate life. Apparently, a number of pharmaceutical companies, when they're recruiting salespeople, literally reach in to the populations of college students and headhunt cheerleaders, okay? Cheerleaders, of course, instinctively know the power of exaggerated positivity, exaggerated masks, exaggerated gestures, right? And it's not just around sales. You know, depending on who you talk to, positive thinking, eradicating your mind of negative thoughts, all these things can do amazing things, okay? According to Rhonda Byrne, or whatever her name is, it can literally attract positive things into your life. Or it can literally destroy cancer, right? Or at the very least, it's going to make you healthier and live longer, right? Some of these claims are rubbish, and some of them maybe have a kernel of truth. And there's certainly payoffs to positive thinking. But I guess what I'm arguing is the one downside of this pressure, this kind of smile or else pressure, is that it can force everyone into being little kind of mini imposters. Okay? That this pressure to maintain the positive performance all the time can be so conspicuous to ourselves that we have to confront that it is a performance, and it becomes exhausting. there is some research on people whose job it is to maintain a positive front all the time. And the burnout's huge, right? As you can imagine, it just chips away at their kind of sense of self, and it's exhausting. Just riffing off this for a moment, Brock Bastian at this university and myself have done some research kind of looking at this a little bit, looking at people who feel as though the world is a world that doesn't accept sadness, that expects you to be happy. And these people feel more down than other people when you remind them of a sad event, okay? Because they don't just have to deal with the primary experience of sadness, they then have to deal with all the secondary experiences of feeling bad about being sad, okay? Feeling like there's something wrong with them, that they're deviant, that they're letting the cultural team down, right? Don't know if you've come across this research on Facebook. Recently, this is quite recent research using experience sampling techniques, so if you're a participant, you get kind of harassed by the experimenters all the time. Every few hours, you get a text message saying, how do you feel now? What's your well-being like, etc. And it turns out that after people have logged on to Facebook or spent time on Facebook, there's a little dip in their mood, there's a little dip in their well-being, okay? And one argument for this is just because you're constantly facing all these airbrushed images and stories. Everyone's putting their best foot forward. It's like this massive kind of collective impression management. And you're constantly exposed to lives that you feel as though you can't compete with, right? And the sum total of that airbrushing is weirdly alienating and kind of depressing, right? But we all do it, right? We all airbrush. And sometimes we get so good at airbrushing that people get tormented with this feeling that any minute now someone's going to expose them for the real person underneath, okay? So this is a couple in the 70s who uncovered what they call the imposter syndrome. They detected that there's a whole bunch of people in the workplace that feel as though their reputations exceed their true abilities. Other people think that they're smarter or more competent than they really are, right? Apparently this is completely rife in academia, right? And it's rife among students, okay? And it's a horrible feeling. Okay, many of these people are quite successful, but they just can't internalize their success. They kind of attribute it to things other than talent. Perseverance, or luck, contacts, timing, impression management, right? And it's a horrible feeling because you're always on the brink of a great shame, right? Any minute now, someone's going to pull the curtain back, Wizard of Oz style, and expose you as the flawed little human that you kind of know yourself to be. And it doesn't matter how much good stuff gets sent to that person, right? If you think that other people think you're up here and you actually think you're down here, you know, the more praise you get, the more pats on the back you get, the more awards you win, the greater that crisis grows, okay? The greater the gulf. And it actually increases anxiety. It doesn't decrease it. So we strive for other people to have a high opinion of us. We strive to put our best foot forward. We strive to impress people. But if we succeed at impressing people, sometimes we're haunted by the sense that what we've effectively done is just fool other people into thinking we're someone we're not, that we become imposters. Right? Okay, in the last few minutes, I'm going to go back to where I started. I'm going to talk about another psychiatric disorder. As you know, one of the symptoms of some mental illness is delusion. And the content of delusions often changes across time, okay, across history. So in the 1800s, there were heaps of people running around claiming to be Napoleon Bonaparte, right? And now virtually no one does that, right? Okay, and it's the same with paranoid delusions, right? It used to be that the Japanese were controlling your mind with radio waves, and then the Soviets were controlling your mind with satellite technology, and then the CIA were implanting computer chips in your mind. And, you know, it's interesting, with each new wave of delusion, it tells you something interesting, I think, about the cultural obsessions and anxieties of that age. Okay. So it turns out that in the last few years, there's been this massive surge in the number of people whose delusion is to think that they're actors in a grand reality TV show, a bit like the Truman Show, right? It's called the Truman delusion. And so people often feel as though everything they do, everything they think is being witnessed by millions of people through their TVs, right? And all the people out there, all the environment around them is just like a studio, it's a set, right? Now, obviously that's crazy, it's a delusion, but in some ways it's a crazy exaggeration of a phenomenon I think we all feel at times. The idea that the role has overtaken us, okay? That we've become less of a person, more of an actor, or that the people around us have become more like audiences than allies, right? And I don't want to be super down on this. I mean, there is an upside to all this. The world is very impressive. The world is very good at impression management. We live in this Dale Carnegie world where people are good at putting their best foot forward and they're very good at influencing people and winning friends, etc. But there is a cost to that. I think that the better we get at that, the harder it is to recover some notion of the authentic self. And this is a problem, okay? Because the research speaks with one voice on this. It's unanimous in saying that one of the biggest predictors of well-being in life is the feeling that you've been free and choiceful and wholehearted and self-determined and authentic in the way that you behave. Okay? This is a good thing. Right? We know this in research in the workplace. We know this from research in relationships. My own research on group psychotherapy suggests that one of the biggest predictors of whether people feel better after group psychotherapy for anxiety or depression is the extent to which they could be themselves in the group. Right? And it's a whole many industries that evolve within academia and outside academia that satisfy that craving that we have for authenticity. Right? But it's difficult. Okay? We live in a world that's become very good at faking realness and presenting something that simulates reality but only 20% more beautiful. Right? Okay? And the world's got very clever at that. We've got politicians who are very good at faking authenticity. We've got TV producers who are very, very good at faking authenticity. Right? We have multinational companies who are very good at faking authenticity. So it's a bit of a Truman Show world in a way. You know, it's pretty, but you know, it can feel a bit fake. Like David, at the beginning of this talk, you remember the guy with Capgras delusion? You might end up looking around and thinking, well, all this looks kind of familiar and kind of real, but it feels empty and cold. Something's not quite right. Okay? And if you want to get really cynical about it, you could argue, like Andrew Potter did in this book, that all this chasing of authenticity has become a kind of phoniness in its own right. Okay, that we kind of get trapped in this hipstery, never-ending, cool chase, trying to find the most authentic food or the most authentic music, the most authentic travel experiences, right? And he coined the term, what was it, conspicuous authenticity, right? That actually rather than finding authenticity, it's just another competition to show how refined your taste is, right? So I think I probably have to stop there because I can feel myself slipping into this old man rant, right? And I didn't want to start hectoring the audience about this. And also, all my caveats coming out now, I don't want to imply that I think that the loss of authenticity is necessarily an exclusively bad thing. In fact, I don't feel that at all. I mean, there's lots of wonderful things about living in a world where you can reinvent yourself and you can perform and there's theatre and all the fun and freedom potentially that implies, right? So I do like that. And I certainly don't want to imply that I'm any different from this. Like certainly don't see myself as an exception to all these rules. In fact, far from it. You know, if I had to ask myself that question, right? Who am I really? Should be the easiest question that any of us could ever answer, right? But you know, I honestly don't know where to begin anymore. Now, it could be that there's a real self lurking around in there somewhere. But after 41 years of all this, you know, I just don't know anymore, right? So maybe this battle for authenticity is a battle that we're doomed to fail, right? But I think it is a battle that's worth fighting, right? And if I'm going to get a bit preachy at the end here, I'd say that to fight that battle, maybe it would pay to just drop our faces every so often, you know, just a little bit more than we feel comfortable with, right? And don't drop your masks or your faces entirely, because that'd be weird and kind of creepy in its own right? You know, just enough, but a bit more than we would feel comfortable with, and enough to give other people the courage and permission to drop their faces a little bit. And maybe, if that happens enough, maybe we can get back to a world that feels just a little bit more real, as opposed to a world that's very good at faking being real. And it might be a world that's 20% less beautiful than the world we live in, but potentially also 20% more fun. Okay. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Matthew. Very informative, but very entertaining.
Oh, thank you.
And we won't see you in the same way. I promise we'll see you 20% more attractive.
Okay.
But let me open the floor for some questions.
Two questions to begin with. One, what's the name of the organisation that tracks imposters? And two, what triggered your interest in researching imposters?
I can't answer that first question. I actually blank on the name of them. There's an organisation within Australia and New Zealand, and there's an organisation in America as well. And it's a covert organisation, so they don't announce who they are, and they do all this undercover kind of stuff. But the second question about what interested me in the question of imposters, I actually have to pay credit to my partner, Sharon Lay. We were just lying in bed, and we were just riffing about, back when I was kind of a lefty activist, there was this massive obsession with authenticity. Okay? So in the activist world, there's this constant vigilance that people are faking their activist worlds. Right? They're not the real deal as a socialist, or they're not really a vegetarian or whatever. And so there's all these words that we have that slap people back in place. If we suspect that they're making a public play for an identity, but they're not the real deal, right? And it becomes kind of oppressive after a while, right? It becomes this constant political struggle to define what the real non-negotiable norms of the group are and what they aren't. And so actually I was just having that conversation with Sharon, and she said, you should do some research on this, and that's where it came from. But it spilled from there, really. Yeah, I can't answer that question. One thing that people tell you as they get older is that one of the benefits of getting older is that they don't care what other people think of them anymore. Okay? And so they create a narrative around themselves as being authentic. Bill von Hippel at this university argues an alternative case. And actually, the research suggests that older people do care what people think of them as much as, if not more than, younger people. So it is a bit of a self-narrative. As you get past a certain age, and you have to be relatively old, I'm talking in your late 80s, and this is Bill von Hippel's research. I don't want to imposter onto his line of research, but your ability to inhibit yourself and to control your language and to control your behavior diminishes a little bit. So your ability to play a role diminishes. And he would argue that actually this idea that I don't care what people think of me and I'm authentic and I'm myself is a narrative to help ease the blow of that. Okay, but, yeah. 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 I don't know. I haven't done that particular experiment, but I know what you're saying. Have you ever done the one where you stare into your eyeballs for ages and eventually you don't look familiar to yourself? That's another one. Don't try that one. It's bad. I think the stuff around thinking that you're 20% more beautiful than you are, I think that partly is pragmatic, that you actually start to adjust how you see yourself in a way that irons out certain flaws. Have you ever had the experience where you know somebody who's got some kind of mild issue with their face, whether that one eye is wandering off a little bit or whatever it is, and when you first meet them, that's something that you notice, and then gradually as you get to know them, you have to remind yourself that's there, you don't notice it. But often when you really notice it is when you see a photo of them. So it's like as you become experienced in interacting with the face, you iron out some of the negative stuff, but when you see a photo, it starts doing the face more. The 20% more beautiful thing, some people, actually Bill von Hippel again, I have to reference him because he argues this is a motivated thing, it's an evolutionary advantage to think that you're better looking than you really are, because that means you're more likely to approach people and it gives you a mating advantage. Okay, so I think Sean Murphy as well, a PhD student here, is doing research like that. Yeah. Well, I think that the only sensible answer to that question is yes. I mean, I think we've forced them into it in a way. I mean, we have a world in which we have a gotcha kind of world where if people violate the script just slightly, then everyone like descends and exploits that. And so politicians have had to get safer and safer and safer in the way they present themselves, to the point that it's incredibly stage managed. We do crave authenticity in our politicians. It's just that some people, I think, are better at faking that than others. You know, and America's become experts at grooming politicians who are really just great actors. I thought George Bush was a great actor. Ronald Reagan literally was an actor. Sarah Palin is a fantastic actress as well. She can really communicate authenticity. Whereas other people, you know, Julia Gillard, who was famous for people who know her, as being a really authentic, kind of seeming person, could never quite capture that in a public forum. So, yeah.
I think it was the late 90s or early 2000s, there was work done in Ultimate Research where people were showing silhouettes of body profiles, each silhouette just represented their body. I'm pretty sure that the treaty that was that women and the market tended to be silhouettes that were heavier.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm aware of that, that paradox that we tend to see ourselves as a little bit prettier face-wise than we really are, and yet I don't think people are walking around thinking they're gorgeous, and certainly not with their bodies. And in fact, you know, the research suggests the other way around. So I literally can't account for that. It's interesting as well, you know, there's stuff on, you know, I said babies like attractive faces. Okay, so for whatever reason, it suggests there may be some kind of evolutionary kind of issue going on there. But I was just looking this up. This is Michelle Herron's research where they were saying babies are actually, they gaze longer at unattractive bodies. Okay, so they go for the pretty faces and the familiar bodies. Okay, so they'd rather look at a body that looks kind of like their mum and dad than a body that looks like a model. So there seems to be some kind of discrepancy there, but I can't really account for that. And thinking that you're better looking than you really are is not the same as well as thinking that you're more attractive than you really are. I mean, being good looking and attractive are different things. My guess is that we think we're slightly better looking than we really are. That's the bad news. But I also suspect that actually we're much more attractive than we give ourselves credit for, and that people are much more forgiving of all the little kind of inconsistencies and the failures of our faces, etc., than we give them credit for. Yeah. 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 I mean, I think that is, and I don't want to overreach here by trying to explain that kind of stuff. I mean, there must be certain things with the two-dimensional image, the static kind of phase, the lights, etc., that sometimes do blow your face up and make you look weird. But I do think it reaches a chronic level where there's been times in my life I was like, oh, you know, for some reason, like every camera seems to be somehow flawed. Like, no one can take a good photo of me. None of these photos look like me. And there's got to be a part of your brain that goes, oh, maybe that's not true. Yeah. Yeah. But this is where your mind just goes, you know, it's like trying to, even conceptualizing the difference between real authenticity and performing authenticity is hard enough, let alone trying to do research on that, or asking people to show insight around that. You know, these are very, very slippery things. So I can't point to research. Maybe other people in the audience might be able to. I don't think that it's necessarily going to change how effective you are at interacting with clients, etc. You know, I think about this sometimes with therapists. If I'm really listening to somebody, I tend to look away a little bit. I don't make eye contact because all the face stuff tends to distract me, right? But of course, the number one signal that people are listening to you is that they're looking at you. Okay, from the client's point of view, this is an open question, there's no answer to it. But from the client's point of view, is it better to be listened to or to feel as though the therapist is listening to you? Okay. Yeah, I don't know. But I think in terms of your own longevity and your own mental health, it's, if you can convince yourself that it's a real performance, it's authentic authenticity, then that's got to be a good thing. Right?
I understand your view on the trend toward authenticity versus impostorism. So, are you saying that we're becoming less authentic, we're more likely to be imposters? But data show that society is much less informed than it once was. I'd say that we're less likely to be imposters now than we were, say, 40 years ago.
Yeah, look, I mean, I have fallen into that trap of making those kind of doughy, kind of nostalgic reflections potentially on the past and saying, oh, we're all getting worse and it's turning to hell in a handbasket. And there's no way of defending that necessarily. I mean, obviously performance has always been a part of life. Yes, people are less conformist than they used to be in traditional paradigms of conformity. That's not to say that they're not conforming to a different shtick, right? It's just a different role that they're conforming to, which might be around resilience, independence, individualism, nonconformity, etc. I'm just like reading tea leaves, getting a sense that we probably are more mannered as a middle class than we used to be. I mean, the world of manners and performances used to be very much an upper class thing, and it was the great cost that complemented the payoffs of being rich and powerful in medieval courts and stuff like that. Whereas now, most of us live in that kind of world where you need to be on. And I feel as though what I'm noticing, and you do see this in the data, is that people are socializing less face-to-face. People are having less interaction than they used to be. That is a very clear trend in the data from the 70s. And I think part of the reason for that is that people are literally exhausted by face-to-face interaction. And part of the reason for that is that there's too many rules attached to it. And there's too much of a pressure on perfection. People aren't lowering the bar enough. Yeah. Some people have a way of moving that's really attractive. And I think what charisma, that word refers to, is a whole series of micro-incidental things that are so small and so complex that we actually can't consciously recognize it, but just springs to life, right? So yes, I mean, I'm very much an advocate that we're all beautiful in various ways, and I've been going on about how superficial we are, but if you're feeling, you might have a degree of schadenfreude to realize that despite all the advantages that objectively, in inverted commas, objectively good-looking people have in life, they're no happier than the rest of us, and their well-being is no greater. One of the arguments for that, by the way, is that one of the downsides of being beautiful is that you never know whether people have been genuine to you. Okay, so if they've been nice to you, you never know if that's because you're beautiful or because they like you. And so you live your life in a constant state of ambiguity around why people are treating you like this. And so that's folding back a bit into the imposter thing a little bit. Yeah. Yeah. Look, I mean, I don't want to sound like a cranky old man. So, I'm not on Facebook. And, what stuns me when I see people on Facebook is just how much the audience billows. Like, it just becomes enormous. You lose control after a while of the number of people who are watching. I could be getting my language wrong here, but I mean, some of you may be aware of, is it Foucault's notion of the panopticon? Like, it was this nightmarish construction that was meant to imply total 100% surveillance of the population. And this is often seen as like a a fascistic kind of metaphor for CCTV and the kind of world that we've entered in. But some people say, well, people are doing that to themselves. It's like a periopticon. You're kind of broadcasting your image to as many people as possible, right? And that's a very different world from the one that my parents grew up in, where the idea of public and private selves is really protected. And the idea of your private self being in the public gaze was seen to be synonymous with being undignified. Whereas now we're in a very different zone. And I'm not sure if psychologically and collectively we're all ready for it. I'm just not sure. Yes, I'm a social psychologist. And yes, reductionist, and we focus on means. But every time we report a mean, we report a standard deviation. There's variation around that mean. And of course, we're all unique creatures, and I rejoice in that variation as well. So that's my answer.
Thanks, Matthew. Can I just draw questions to a close? Matthew's going to be around here for a few more minutes, so I know that there are other questions there in the audience. Please come down and ask. But can you join me in thanking Matthew for a really entertaining talk? If I can just say two things in closing. If there's anybody here who would actually like to receive any emails or information about further events, some of you already are on our alumni e-newsletter. Please come down, sign up. We'd be very happy to circulate this information to you. And also, some of you would have recognised that we have offered this as a CPD event. So if there are people who are interested in collecting a CPD certificate, also come down here and collect that from us. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. I hope you've had a good night.